Is making rounds online. Iranian protesters can be seen setting fire to a Bazir's base in the Chenar area of Azadabad in Iran's Hamadan province.
In January 2026, one of the most powerful warships ever built suddenly changed course. The USS Abraham Lincoln, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier the length of 3 football fields, was quietly sailing through the South China Sea when it received new orders. Turn around, head to the Persian Gulf, and do it fast. Within days, the ship arrived in the Middle East surrounded by destroyers armed with hundreds of missiles, fighter jets, and enough firepower to strike targets deep inside an entire country. So what exactly happened? Why did the United States rush one of its most powerful military assets across thousands of miles of ocean in just a matter of days? Let's find out. To understand what is happening right now, you first need to understand what the USS Abraham Lincoln actually is. Because this is not just any ship. The Abraham Lincoln is a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. It is over 330 meters long and weighs more than 100,000 tons. Its 2 nuclear reactors mean it never needs to stop and refuel itself, though it still needs regular resupply of food, ammunition, and jet fuel for its aircraft. On board is Carrier Air Wing 9, one of the most dangerous collections of military aircraft ever assembled in one place. We are talking about F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters, F/A-18E, and F Super Hornet jets, EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft, whose job is to blind and jam enemy radar systems, and E-2D Hawkeye surveillance planes that can track hundreds of targets simultaneously. The crew numbers over 5,000 sailors. But what makes an aircraft carrier truly frightening is not just the ship itself. It is the entire strike group that moves with it. When Abraham Lincoln goes somewhere, it goes with 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers. These ships carry Tomahawk cruise missiles that can travel over 1,600 kilometers and hit a target with pinpoint accuracy. Together, this is called a carrier strike group, and it is one of the most powerful conventional military forces on the planet. The United States operates 11 of these. Wherever one shows up in the world, it sends one unmistakable message. The Americans are here, and they are not playing around. To understand why Abraham Lincoln was sent rushing to the Persian Gulf, you need to go all the way back to the night of the 21st of June, 2025, because that is the night the United States did something it had never done before in the entire history of modern warfare. At around midnight, 13 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers quietly rolled down the runway at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. These are the most secretive aircraft in the world, and 13 of them taking off at the same time was an extraordinary sight that almost nobody in the world knew was happening. 6 of those bombers immediately turned west and headed toward the Pacific Ocean. Their job was to act as decoys. They wanted Iranian intelligence to think any attack was coming from the west, from Guam. The real strike package, 7 bombers, quietly turned east and headed out over the Atlantic Ocean. For the next 18 hours, those 7 bombers crossed the Atlantic, flew down over the Mediterranean, and made their way toward Iran, refueling from tanker aircraft multiple times in midair along the way. The pilots were flying with minimal communications to avoid detection. Once they reached the Middle East, they linked up with American F-35 and F-22 stealth fighters who flew into Iranian airspace ahead of the bombers. Their job was to draw out and suppress Iran's surface-to-air missile systems, but no missiles were ever fired at them. Israel had spent the previous 2 weeks systematically destroying Iran's air defense network, and so American aircraft flew over Iran almost completely undetected. Then, at around 2 inches the morning, Iranian time on June 22, the B-2S began dropping their payload. 6 of the 7 bombers targeted the Fordo nuclear facility, a site buried 80 to 90 meters underground inside a mountain. Each bomber dropped multiple GBU, 5-7 massive ordnance penetrators. These are 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs. 14 of them were dropped in total across Fordo and Natanz. They had never been used in actual combat before. Only the B-2 is powerful enough to carry them. Simultaneously, an Ohio-class U.S. submarine in the region fired more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles at the Isfahan nuclear site. In total, over 125 American aircraft were involved across the entire operation. The Pentagon later confirmed it was the largest B-2 strike mission in the history of the United States Air Force. Trump went on television that night and said Iran's nuclear facilities had been completely and totally obliterated.
A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the three key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime: Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. Everybody heard those names for years as they built this horribly destructive.
The Pentagon later assessed that Iran's nuclear program had been set back by approximately 1 to 2 years. Almost all of Iran's operating centrifuges were destroyed or made inoperable. The operation was called Midnight Hammer. Iran retaliated the very next day by firing missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, where thousands of U.S. troops are stationed. There were no American casualties. A ceasefire was then announced between Iran and Israel. And for a few months, the world appeared to exhale. But the story was far from over. After Midnight Hammer, Iran was in deep trouble. The strikes had humiliated the regime in front of the entire world, and the international sanctions that had been strangling the country's economy for years were now becoming completely unbearable. By late December 2025, the Iranian rial had collapsed so badly that ordinary families were watching their entire life savings evaporate overnight. Shopkeepers could not afford to restock their shelves. Factories were shutting down. Millions of Iranians were struggling to afford basic food. And so, on the 28th of December 2025, shopkeepers across Iran walked out and refused to open their businesses. Students joined them. Factory workers joined them. Housewives joined them. Within days, the protests had spread to every major city in the country. These were not small demonstrations. The streets of Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, Tabriz, and dozens of other cities were flooded with hundreds of thousands of people. And this time, their demands went far beyond just economic grievances. They were chanting for the end of the Islamic Republic entirely. They were waving the lion and sun flag of the old Iranian monarchy that had been banned since the 1979 revolution. They were openly calling for Supreme Leader Khamenei to step down. Iran's Supreme Leader responded by ordering his security forces to do whatever was necessary to crush the protests by any means necessary. Those are his exact words, confirmed later by the New York Times. And what happened next was one of the worst atrocities in modern Iranian history. On January 8 and 9, 2026, Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces and Basij paramilitary units opened fire on protesters with live ammunition simultaneously across dozens of cities. Eyewitnesses described seeing hundreds of bodies in the streets of Tehran alone. Hospitals were overwhelmed and ran out of space. Iran then imposed the most comprehensive internet and communications blackout in the country's history, cutting Iranians off from the outside world and from each other. Because of that blackout, the exact death toll is still disputed and will likely never be fully known. Iran's own government, which has a long history of undercounting deaths during protests, admitted at least 3,117 people were killed. Human rights group Hayrana documented over 7,000 confirmed deaths by early February, with thousands more still under investigation. The Guardian and Time magazine reported the death toll could be over 30,000. Iran International, citing classified Iranian government documents it obtained directly from inside the IRGC's own intelligence organization, reported that more than 36,500 people were killed in just those 2 days alone on January 8 and 9. Over 42,000 people were arrested. Iran's judiciary chief publicly told prosecutors to move fast. He said, and these are his words again, confirmed by video on Iranian state television, "If we want to do something, we have to do it quickly." The world was horrified, and in Washington, President Trump was furious. Trump had been watching the situation in Iran unfold on television like the rest of the world. He posted publicly on social media, telling Iranian protesters that help was on its way. He warned Iran's government in very direct terms that if they executed political prisoners who had been arrested during the protests, there would be very strong consequences. But words alone were not enough. Washington needed to back up that threat with something Iran's leaders would actually take seriously. And around the 15th of January 2026, the USS Abraham Lincoln received new orders. The carrier was in the South China Sea at the time, operating as part of its scheduled Western Pacific deployment. It was told to immediately change course, head for the Middle East, and transfer from U.S. Indo-Pacific Command over to U.S. Central Command, the branch of the American military responsible for the Persian Gulf and the broader Middle East. This was a significant strategic decision. Pulling a carrier out of the Pacific creates a real gap in that region and sends a highly visible signal to every government watching, including China, that the Middle East situation has become serious enough to accept that risk. The Abraham Lincoln made its way through the Indian Ocean and officially entered the U.S. Central Command area of responsibility on the 26th of January 2026. CENTCOM publicly confirmed the deployment on social media that same day, saying the carrier strike group was deployed to the Middle East to promote regional security and stability. With the carrier came 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers: the USS Frank E. Peterson Jr., the USS Spruance, and the USS Michael Murphy. Each of them is loaded with Tomahawk cruise missiles and advanced missile defense systems. Trump publicly referred to the buildup as a massive armada heading toward Iran. But the carrier was just the most visible part of a much larger and quieter operation being assembled around the entire region at the same time. The Abraham Lincoln was just the beginning. F-15E Strike Eagle jets were quietly relocated all the way from RAF Lakenheath in England to Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, cutting their flying distance to Iranian targets dramatically. Tanker aircraft flooded into Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. THAAD and Patriot missile defense batteries were repositioned to protect American bases and Allied facilities across the Gulf from potential Iranian retaliation. Surveillance aircraft, electronic warfare planes, and hundreds of military cargo flights carrying equipment and personnel were all flowing into the region simultaneously. By the 20th of February 2026, satellite imagery of Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan alone, a base that few people had ever heard of before, showed 18 F-15E Strike Eagles, 18 F-35A stealth fighters, 12 F-16 Fighting Falcons, 6 EA-18G Growler electronic warfare jets, and 2 MQ-9 Reaper drones. Every single visible parking space for a combat aircraft at that base was full. Tyler Rogaway, of The War Zone, one of the most respected defense analysts in the United States, posted that every designated tactical jet parking space visible from satellite is taken. Defense officials being cited in American media were describing what they were building as a force capable of weeks-long operations against Iran. That is not the language you use when you are bluffing. And then came the news that made clear just how serious this was. On the 13th of February 2026, sources confirmed that Trump had ordered a second aircraft carrier to the Middle East. This time, it was the USS Gerald R. Ford, the largest and most technologically advanced aircraft carrier ever built. The Ford had been operating in the Caribbean after the U.S. military conducted a separate operation there. But it was now crossing the Atlantic and heading east. On the 20th of February 2026, confirmed photographs and ship spotters showed the Ford passing through the Strait of Gibraltar and entering the Mediterranean Sea, heading toward the Middle East to eventually join the Abraham Lincoln. 2 carrier strike groups in the same theater at the same time is an extraordinarily rare event. And defense analysts described the combined air and naval buildup as the largest American military presence in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Iran was not staying quiet while all of this was happening. Senior Iranian military commanders issued blunt public warnings. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps told Washington and its allies to avoid any miscalculation, warning that if attacked, all American bases and facilities in the region would become what they called legitimate targets. Iran sent a formal letter to the United Nations Security Council putting this warning on the official record. And then Iran backed its words with action. On the 3rd of February 2026, 6 Iranian Revolutionary Guard Navy gunboats swarmed an American tanker called the Stena Imperative in the Strait of Hormuz and attempted to stop and seize it. The tanker's crew ignored the demands, kept moving, and the ship was escorted safely to the Arabian Sea by the USS McFall destroyer. That same day, an F-35 fighter jet from the Abraham Lincoln, which was operating approximately 500 miles south of Iran's coastline in the Arabian Sea, shot down an Iranian Shahed 139 drone that had been maneuvering toward the carrier. 2 days later, on February 5, the Revolutionary Guard's Navy seized 2 foreign oil tankers near Farsi Island in the Persian Gulf, claiming the vessels were involved in fuel smuggling. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes every single day, was becoming the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth. Here is where the situation gets complicated, because at the exact same time all of this military hardware was moving into position, diplomacy was also quietly happening. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was publicly warning that Tehran would respond with full force to any attack. But at the same time, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian was telling his foreign minister to pursue direct negotiations with the United States, framing diplomacy as acceptable as long as it was free from threats and unrealistic demands. Behind the scenes, indirect talks between Iranian and American negotiators were being held in Geneva and Oman, with Iranian officials also passing messages through Qatar as an intermediary. By late February 2026, the United States had confirmed that Iran was expected to submit a written proposal outlining what it was willing to offer to resolve the standoff. A White House official confirmed Iran would provide detailed proposals within 2 weeks. The U.S. was reportedly considering lifting some financial and oil sanctions as part of a deal, while simultaneously demanding Iran give up its enriched uranium stockpile and dramatically scale back its nuclear program. Trump said publicly he believed negotiations would ultimately succeed, while in the same breath warning of far greater military consequences if they did not. Top American national security officials were simultaneously telling Trump they believed the U.S. military was fully prepared for weeks-long operations against Iran if diplomacy failed. The pressure on both sides was immense. Meanwhile, the Iranian people were still living in fear and grief. Families of those killed during the January massacres were holding the traditional 4-0-day mourning ceremonies, gathering quietly at graves across the country, many still chanting anti-government slogans even at funerals. On the 14th of February 2026, Reza Pahlavi, the son of Iran's last Shah, declared a global day of action, calling on Iranians to chant from their rooftops and windows in solidarity with the pro-democracy movement. Reports were still coming in of detained protesters being put on fast-track trials, facing the death penalty. We will be covering every update as it happens, so if you are not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a single video.